This is the myth is tax cuts are driving the nation into debt. Now, this was a recent tweet by Heather Cox Richardson, who you might know of her. She's a journalist and very outspoken, kind of a center left journalist that a lot of people in the Democratic Party really support a lot of her messaging in social media. But this is just flat out false. Tax cuts are not the primary reason that our nation is $34 trillion in debt. Consider the Trump tax cuts in 2017, I think is when they occurred. Roughly speaking, that was a $2 trillion tax cut over 10 years. So the impact on revenue, roughly speaking, is about $200 billion a year in so-called lost revenue, if you want to frame it that way. And in fact, the George W. Bush tax cuts in the early 2000s was about the same impact. It impacted revenue around $200 billion a year. So even if you added together the tax cuts of Trump and Bush, roughly speaking, and let's say you remove the tax cuts, maybe revenue would go up about $400 billion a year. Maybe. That's assuming everything else stays the same, that there are no secondary effects of those tax increases. But the deficit right now is almost $2 trillion. In fact, last I checked, it was $1.7 trillion. The deficit through the COVID years was like stupid high. It was like $4 or $5 trillion. The deficit hasn't been below $500 billion a year for God knows how long. I don't think it was ever that low, even during Obama. The fact is that it's overspending that is creating all this debt, because no matter how much they promise taxes. Look at George W. Bush, massive expansion of war in Afghanistan and Iraq, massive expansion of the Department of Education under Republican George W. Bush. He almost doubled funding for the Department of Education. Huge expansion of the police state, the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, beefing up the FBI, the CIA, and all of that. And Bush increased spending on Medicare for prescription drugs. And all of those spending increases, plus countless others, are massively more than the tax cuts that he offered in 2001 and in 2003. Same thing is true with Trump. When Trump was president, even before COVID, he just wanted to keep spending money. He wanted to increase pay for the troops, and you may support that, and there's a lot of reasons to support that, but he wanted to spend more money on military, more money on Social Security, more money on Medicare, and then a shit ton of money on corporate welfare, because Trump wanted to try to win over people by giving them free stuff, by giving them more. And to hell, to the debt, the deficit, be damned with that. He didn't care. And even during the Trump years, even after the tax cut in 2017, revenue went up, federal revenue went up every year. Every year. But spending went up way more. The same thing is true of President Bush. In the 2003 tax cuts, revenue went up for the federal government for 4 straight years after that. And then it finally took a dive in 2008. Well, what happened in 2008? Of course, there was the Great Recession, but that certainly wasn't caused by tax cuts. So a lot of people will throw around these tax cut accusations, trying to point the finger that it's the problem is the rich, the problem is the corporations, yada, yada. But in reality, neither one of these parties, Republican or Democrat, care about the debt. The Republicans are often blamed during the Trump years that he increased the national debt by $7 trillion in his 1 4-year term, which is true. But Biden has done approximately the same in his 4-year term. And in fact, if you look at the national debt and how much has been created historically by both Republican and Democratic presidential administrations, it's roughly 50-50. Roughly speaking, about half of it was created under Republican presidents, and roughly half of it was created by Democratic presidents. I mean, President Obama, all by himself, was almost a $10 trillion increase in the national debt in his 8 years. So people saying tax cuts are driving the nation into debt, that's propaganda. That's divisive. It's trying to pit, one group against another, and it's disconnected from reality. But you're going to see a lot of this in the current election cycle.